Welcome to Powell Hall and God on Trial. I'm Larry Taunton, Executive Director of Fixed Point Foundation, the sponsor for this evening's debate. Our two combatants are widely recognized as powerful and eloquent spokesmen for their respective worldviews. To my right, and representing the atheist perspective, is none other than author, journalist, and philosopher. I think we can say that he is a philosopher, Christopher Hitchens. If the title of his bestseller, God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, left you wondering precisely what Mr. Hitchens thinks about religious belief, I'm confident that by this evening's conclusion, you will have no doubt. Opposing him, and to my left, is Dinesh D'Souza. A best-selling author, formerly a fellow of the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, a White House policy analyst. He is perhaps best known for his political writing. However, in his most recent book, What's So Great About Christianity, Mr. D'Souza weighs in on the subject of this evening's debate. Let us give both men a warm welcome. A word about the debate and the format. The subject of tonight's debate is it good to believe in God? In this sense, it may be said that God is on trial here this evening, or belief in God, depending upon your perspective. By God, we mean the Christian God. We will begin with opening statements. Both men will receive about 10 minutes apiece. This will be followed by 5-minute rebuttals, and then a 15-minute rapid-fire Q&A session. This is kind of like ping pong here, where the two of them will be questioning one another. And then, after this series of short exchanges, you, the members of the audience, will be invited to offer your own questions. You will see 2 mics down here in the front of the stage, and you'll just simply queue up there at the appropriate time. Finally, Mr. D'Souza and Mr. Hitchens will offer their closing remarks. Now, it perhaps goes without saying that passions run high with issues like religion and politics, and you'll very likely get both from these men this evening. Many of you are bound to take issue with what you hear from this stage tonight, but we ask that you extend to these gentlemen every courtesy. I can say without reservation that if you knew them, regardless of your opinion on the issues, you would like them. Tonight's...
Nice. Too easy to say.
I promise. We will begin with Mr. D'Souza.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I want to thank the Fixed Point Foundation for putting on this debate. I notice we have rather exotic setups and rather unusual podiums. I'm relieved I remembered to wear pants. I'm delighted to be here from California. Christopher Hitchens came in from Washington, D.C. I used to live in Washington, D.C., a city that seems to combine northern efficiency and southern charm. We're here to debate, is it good to believe in God, and specifically the Christian God? Now, in some senses, when you talk about God, here is a topic on which nobody really knows for sure. In other words, we approach this topic to some degree, both of us, in the dark. What comes after death? No one knows. In a sense, I would, in calling myself a believer, distinguish belief from knowledge. When you believe something, You don't know. I wouldn't say I believe in my brother. I know the guy. In that sense, there is a gap between belief and knowledge. I would like to argue that it makes more sense, it's more reasonable, it will make our life better, it will infuse our life with a sense of purpose and destiny if we acknowledge that there is a God. And I will also make the case that it makes the most sense to believe in the Christian God and in Christ. Why should we believe in God? What are the indicators that point us to God? Well, the first one is there needs to be some explanation for why we have a universe. Interestingly, we have a universe, and modern science tells us that this universe had a beginning, which is to say, not only that all of matter, but space and time itself had a beginning. What is the cause for which the universe is the effect? Now, you might say there could be a natural cause or there could be a supernatural cause. We can write off the natural cause because the universe encompasses all of nature. Therefore, it would seem to make sense to posit a non-natural, or I will say supernatural, cause. I'm going to argue that it makes sense to believe in God. Christopher Hitchens is going to argue it makes sense to believe that we are, in a sense, evolved Darwinian primates without the need to posit a creator. But if we are evolved Darwinian primates, evolved presumably to survive and reproduce, to perpetuate our genes, in what sense can we hold our beliefs to be true? In other words, in what sense can we hold even this debate to be a debate not just about what's useful or what's adaptive, but what's actually true? We might have evolved larger brains in order to get along better in the world, but how is it that we can posit laws about the universe, the rotation of the planets, E equals mc squared? Those would seem to be very unnecessary propositions for us to survive as Darwinian primates. And then, of course, there is morality. And what I mean by morality is not the low level of morality, which is essentially you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. What I mean by morality is that little voice inside our head when we want to do something to further ourselves or fulfill our desires or promote our self-interest, the little voice that seems to urge no. In other words, morality defined as a force that operates against self-interest. And we see this both in the great sacrifices of people who give their lives. We also see it in the very simple act of someone who gets up and donates blood, or someone who gets up to give a seat to someone in a bus, something for which you have no possibility of gain. What is the Darwinian explanation for that? I would suggest that there isn't one. The mathematician Pascal many years ago offered a very interesting argument for how you decide when you are, as we are, in the dark. When you don't know about something and there's really no possibility of empirical evidence on questions of things like, is there life after death? We can't wait for dead people to come back and tell us. We've got to think about it with what we know now. And Pascal says when you're faced with an important decision of that nature, you have to weigh the odds. You have to consider the chance of being wrong in each case. And so in this case, we can say, what if I believe in God, but there's no God? What's the downside? And the downside, Pascal points out, is simply metaphysical error. If you believe in God and you turn out to be wrong, you will have gotten a retroactive C in philosophy class. But what about the opposite? What if you reject God and it turns out that you're wrong? Pascal argues in that case you face a much more troubling prospect: separation, eternal separation from God. So Pascal asks, given this, what rational guy acting in the dark would vote against God? Now, let's note that Pascal is not making an argument for Christianity. He's making an argument for the acceptance of God. I want to talk a little more specifically now, in the time I have left, about Christianity. Because you might ask, why do we accept these exotic Christian doctrines, the fall, the resurrection, the miracles, Jesus, and so on? In some ways, I would put it sort of this way. I would begin with a proposition I think that there's no one in this room would deny. Things are not as they ought to be. Is there anyone who disputes that? Things are not as they ought to be. Now, if things are not as they ought to be, it follows that we live on two levels. Here's the way we are as human beings, and here's the way that all of us, in some senses, understand that we should be. You may say the level of what is and the level of what should be. The human level, and you may say the divine level. The distance between those two levels is what Christians mean when we use the term the fall. And in some ways, all the religions of the world are efforts to bridge this enormous chasm between what is the case and what ought to be the case. We find in the Eastern religions a very easy diagnosis of what's wrong. What's wrong is the self. We are the problem. And what is the solution? Abolish the self. In some senses, if we can eradicate the I that is experiencing all these difficulties, then according to Hinduism and Buddhism, in slightly different variants, we solve the problem. I regard that as an intellectually sound conclusion, but a little impractical. Then you have the Jewish and the Islamic solution to the problem, which is essentially rules. You can look upon the rules of Judaism and the rules of Islam, rules of diet, rules of kosher, rules of circumcision, rules of facing in the direction of Mecca, rules of praying 5 times a day, as a human effort to construct a ladder to cross this enormous chasm, if you will, from the human level to the divine level. It's the premise of Christianity, it's actually the anthropological observation of Christianity that no matter how high you build this human ladder, it's not going to get there. It's inadequate. That if this chasm is to be crossed, it's only going to be crossed in one way, and that is in some senses for the divine level, i.e. for God, to condescend across the chasm to the human level, and that is the emissary that as Christians we would point to in Jesus. That Christ is, if you will, the divine enterprise of reaching into history, crossing the divine level and enabling this enormous gap to be bridged.
30 seconds.
I have a lot more to say about all this, but let me just say that I think that if you are an atheist, what you are really saying is that there is no such thing as enduring morality, even though you live by it. There's no such thing as enduring rationality, even though you assume it and come to debate about it. And in some senses, you have no basis on which to develop, except on a kind of relativistic way, a sense of meaning and purpose in life. As Christians, though, not only can we account for the world as it is, not only does the world make sense, but our lives make sense, and we have a morality we can pass on to our children. It brings us closer to what Milton called Eden, a paradise within thee, happier far. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Okay. I was wondering if we were going to blow a whistle. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers, sisters, comrades, friends, my fellow Americans, it's taken me a while to get to say that, and fellow primates. Ironic but accepting co-mammals. Look, you can't not have noticed, not just in spite of, but because of the great dexterity of my friend Dinesh D'Souza, that he wants to argue for deism. In other words, you can't absolutely show there's no prime mover. You can't absolutely show there's no designer. You can't absolutely disprove. No atheist has ever been able to wish to claim that you can say there is no author, but you can say there's no argument for the authorship or the design or the deity or the creator that's ever been valid or coherent or integral. But he wants to smuggle through the customs of the argument about deism an argument for theism. If he could prove there was an author, a prime mover, a deity, a creator, which he can't do, and no such person on his side, even as clever as he, or cleverer, has ever been able to do, all his main work as a Christian would still be ahead of him, because he would still have to be able to show that this author knew that you and I were here tonight, that they minded with whom we went to bed and in what position, that they minded what we ate, that they minded how we circumcised our children, in what manner genital mutilation was done by us, that they cared. Now, there's a huge difference between the concept of an authorship of the cosmos and the universe and the idea of an intervening, caring, utterly supervising, knowing, and some say loving, though they have a lot to prove at that point, deity. And I shall begin by not attempting anything surreptitious, not trying to smuggle through customs a theism by a deism or an atheism by an anti-deism. I shall say specifically that I'm an anti-theist and that I believe that the emancipation from religion is the fundamental emancipation that the human mind must undergo before it can consider any very serious questions. And I'll phrase it like this. Our objection, my objection on our side, to the concept of a divine supremacy is this, that it refers all the undecidable, agonizing questions of our species, of our being. How shall we live? How shall we make the just city? Is there a point to our existence? How are we to consider the rights and duties that we have one with and to another? And many, many other extremely arduous and terrible questions that no one human generation will ever solve or is ever going to be able to solve, and refers them upward to a totalitarian, absolutist, unanswerable monarch, and says, only this tyrant can decide. And without him, we would have no knowledge of ethics or morality or realism or any of these questions. It is the beginning of servility. It's the beginning of abjection. It is the definition of the master-slave relationship. It's what needs to be broken in our mentality before we can be free. It is the reason for the Virginia Statute on Religious Liberty. It is the reason for the First Amendment for the Constitution. It is the reason for the idea of the separation of church and state, that it cannot be, it may not be, theologically legislated. The manner in which we discuss philosophy, morals, ethics, and all the other great questions that will always agitate us, and to which there is, it can be fairly said, no end. If I make no other point this evening, if I leave nothing else in your mind, I'll be grateful if you've listened just that far. Now, I know a lot of atheists, many of them former believers, who say they wish they could believe, or they have nostalgia for the time when they could go to confession or go to Mass and believe in the sacraments or whatever it might be, or they miss the time that they could say Allahu Akbar and really mean it, or go to the Wailing Wall and press a piece of paper into a man-made structure and think that they were communicating directly with Yahweh. They stopped being able to believe it. They wish they still could. I say, why do you miss it? Why do you want to be a slave? Why do you want to be a serf? Why do you want Big Brother to be in charge? Do you wish it to be true that there is someone who has you under permanent, round-the-clock supervision and surveillance, who knows what you think even when you are asleep, who can convict you, I borrow again from the Big Brother analogy, of thought crime, and who can condemn you forever to eternal penalty and torture if you make the smallest mistake, who creates you sick, who makes you a sinner, who says you are originally wicked, and then orders you to be well and to recover on penalty of torture. What is this but the most horrific sadomasochistic prostration of the human personality before the most interstellar coldness of authority and tyranny? Why does anyone wish this was true? To emancipate oneself from this, it seems to me, is the beginning of the long story of human liberation. And from very early days, from Democritus, from Lucretius, from Epicurus, all the way through to Spinoza, to Einstein, to our own day, that's been the real struggle. The right to look the churches and the priests and the godheads in the eye and say, I don't believe it. I don't believe a word of it, and you can't make me. It's the beginning of civilization, as well as the beginning of liberation. Today's news from North Korea cheered me up very much. I hope he's dying. And I hope it takes him a long time. And I hope it's agony and shame and misery and pain for him. I've been in North Korea. I've actually been in all the axis of evil countries. I used to wonder when I was a child, what's it like? When they told me, here's what hell is like, I could see what hell would be like. Eternal punishment for things I'd never done. I could get that point all right. But eternal praise for an eternal leader that goes on forever, always thanking him, always groveling to him, always sprawling in front of him. I thought, sounds like hell to me. But I couldn't picture it. I've been in North Korea, I can picture it. The sprawling, the abject groveling of a whole people in front of a godhead. Remember, when Mr. Bush writes to Kim Jong-il, he calls him Mr. Chairman, not Mr. President. Why not? Kim Jong-il isn't the president of North Korea. Who is president? His late father is the president. His father has been dead for 15 years. North Korea is a necrocracy. It's a thanatocracy. It's a mausolocracy. Its current leader is considered the reincarnation of his father. It's one short of a trinity. It's a totally worshipful state with a god, and it's the most horrible tyranny on the face of the earth, possibly ever on the face of the earth. And I've been there, and I've never been so happy to leave anywhere in my entire life, which North Koreans can't do. They can't. They can't get out of it. They're locked in that jail, in that godly jail forever. But at least, is this being filmed? Recorded? Never mind. At least you can die and get out of North Korea. Monotheism doesn't allow you that. When you die, according to Judaism, of which Christianity is a plagiarism, and to Islam, which is a plagiarism of Judaism, an ignorant plagiarism of Judaism and Christianity, that's when the fun really begins. That's when the tyranny really starts. That's when you find out who's boss. Who wants this to be true? Who thinks that this kind of servile, abject, groveling, fearful life, the preparation for an eternity of misery and shame, is worth having, is worth defending, is worth speaking up for? Who isn't delighted to find that the answer to all Dinesh's questions, rhetorical and otherwise, this evening, sweetly put as they were, to all of them is no. No, Dinesh, no. There is no reason to think that what physicists call the Big Bang, now call the Big Bang, requires a supernatural explanation. You can't find a physicist who thinks that theory doesn't work without a supernatural one. They may say it works with, but there's no one who will say it wouldn't work if you don't make that assumption. There is no biologist, there is no geologist who won't say the same about the evolution of our globe, the layers all the way back to the Cambrian and Devonian, that requires a supernatural explanation. None of it requires that. The study of amino acids, sorry?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Will I need all those? The study of proteins and amino acids and our own interior biology requires it. It doesn't. As Laplace, the greatest of all physicists, said when asked, when he produced the first working model of the universe, asked by another arrogant, self-crowned, worship-demanding emperor, Bonaparte, there seems to be no God in your model, Laplace says, well, sir, Your Majesty, it works without that assumption. Yes, it does, and so must we, if we are to claim the liberty that is our birthright. Thank you.
You have 5 minutes to respond.
Thank you. I think we see in some ways, I think in a very striking way, the thrust of what can be called the new atheism. And I say this because in normal conversation, when you talk to an atheist, you get a lot of, well, I don't believe because I just don't have enough evidence. If only there was proof that was in front of me, I would be a believer. I think in Christopher Hitchens, you get something very revealing, a certain kind of honest atheism. Christopher Hitchens begins with some perfunctory comments about deism. He says, I don't distinguish between deism and theism. Well, deism is a form of theism. Every deist believes that there is a creator, God, who set the universe in motion. So deism is a subset of theism. Jefferson was a deist. He was also a theist. North Korea. Now we're getting a little closer to what's motivating modern atheism. I will point out, by the way, that North Korea and Cuba are the two remaining residues of what could be called the great atheist enterprise of the 20th century. When we think of religion, we think of the crimes of bin Laden and radical Islam. How many people has bin Laden killed? 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000? Even a junior league atheist like Pol Pot, who doesn't even make it into the top ranks of Mao and Stalin. Pol Pot, in the space of about 3 years in Indochina after the Vietnam War, manages to wipe out, with his Khmer Rouge regime, some 2 million people. So what we are seeing here is the last gasp, and thank God for it, of an attempt to create the purely secular society, redeemed or removed from the influence without religion, without morality, a society, if you will, rather than worship God, we worship, if you will, the substitute God, the dictator, the ideology. So I think that the example of North Korea, far from undermining religion, with which Kim Jong-il has nothing to do, is actually an illustration of what happens to societies when they try to purge religion completely. Now, some years ago, the philosopher Tom Nagel made a comment. He was thinking about the issue of God, and he said, it's not that I don't believe in God. He said, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Now, at first glance, this may seem like a little bit of a puzzle. Why would someone not want God to exist? And I think we begin to get the answer from Christopher Hitchens. First of all, let's consider for the moment his complaint that to believe in Christianity is somehow to be placed under the subjugation of some kind of a totalitarian regime. First of all belief in God, and certainly Christianity, is based on free choice. No one is being forced into it. You are free to say yes, and you are free to say no. That's the whole message of the Garden of Eden. Then, quite apart from having any totalitarian recipe, I agree there are moral codes in Islam and in certain religions that are harsh. In Christianity, the basic code is so gentle. In other words, no matter how lengthy the roster of your misdeeds, somebody else, Christ, paid for them. All that is required for you is to accept that fact. Not even to stop sinning, but merely to accept that you are not the author of your own salvation, and such is the perversity and obstinacy of human nature that this simple act of acknowledgement is viewed as totalitarian. Why is it viewed as totalitarian? Because we can't believe in the resurrection and the miracles? It turns out that Christopher Hitchens' objection has nothing to do with that.
30 seconds.
Rather, the objection, you might say, is to Christian morality. It's to the idea of ultimate moral accountability. Religions are about moral accountability. They're about what goes around comes around. In life, very often the bad guy ends up ahead. The good guy comes to grief. Christianity says that there will be, if you will, a last judgment. So does Hinduism. Hinduism says if you've been a lousy rat in this life, we'll be seeing you as a cockroach in the next life. Cosmic justice.
Time.
It is a rebellion against morality, a desire to escape from the moral rules of Christianity. This is what is driving the new atheism. Thank you.
Mr. Hitchens? Mr. Hitchens, 5 minutes.
Sir, I would be just as happy to have my atheism described as the old-fashioned kind. There's nothing really neo about my beliefs any more than there is about, say, someone else who Dinesh slightly misrepresents, Thomas Jefferson. He may well have been a deist. It's thought by most of us that that was the default position for an educated person in those days. After all, he would correspond, among the many skills he had, was that of a paleontologist, with de Buffon, the current leading natural scientist of the time, saying, "Why do you think it is that in Virginia there are seashells so high up on the mountain tops? We can't work out how that could possibly be, or how there should be these fossil bones." Questions that to all of us are easily decidable were, as recently as the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, opaque. And after all, Charles Darwin wasn't going to be born until 1809, as it happens, the exact same day as Abraham Lincoln. Charles Darwin being I think, the greater of the two emancipators, to help us decide these questions. But it is now accepted by everyone who studies these matters that there is no needful supernatural explanation for anything that confronts us, and I was pleased not to be challenged on this by Dinesh, in the natural world, which makes the religious case an optional one, which again makes me rephrase my question. Why do you want it to be true? Now, Dinesh says you can be a Christian or you can not be a Christian. I don't know where he gets this from. I've heard him in recent debates, we've met each other before on these matters, say, he asked his father, "Daddy, we live in India, we have Portuguese surnames, why are we Catholics when everyone else in India tends to be Hindu or Muslim?" And his father said, I think rather sapiently, well, it's because of the Portuguese Inquisition, actually, forcible conversion. That's why a certain number of people in Goa are called D'Souza and are Catholics. By the way, there is always a material explanation for why any person in any country is a member of any one religion. If George Bush had been born in Saudi Arabia, he would be just as stupid a Muslim as he is today a Methodist. And he would be just as convinced that he wouldn't know about morality unless he was a Sunni. I underline that point. Does Christianity give you the option where it says, well, here's why I think Christianity is immoral, I'll say briefly, since Dinesh has agreed to meet me on this ground. The doctrine of vicarious redemption is, in my judgment, I'll submit it to you for your verdict, and not an amoral one, an immoral one. What does vicarious redemption say? It says, you may throw your sins upon another person and have them taken away by his torture to death. Now, comrades, brothers, sisters, of any one of you who is my friend, I might say, I'll pay your debt. You're in trouble, you have no money, I have, I'll pay your debt. Your debts, forget the debt. If you were in really serious trouble, there have been circumstances, Charles Dickens wrote about them very well in The Tale of Two Cities, I might agree to take your place in prison. I suppose, if in the case of extreme, abject, selfless love, I could offer to take your place on the scaffold, but I cannot relieve you of your responsibilities. I cannot say you didn't commit this crime. I cannot say that you are guiltless of this sin. I cannot say that you did not commit this great offense against morality. I cannot take it from you. The promise to do that is an immoral promise. So is the promise to do it by human sacrifice. Just as it is immoral for the New Testament to try and vindicate the hideous, blood-stained, genocidal, racist demands of the Old Testament, which, as you remember, had it the other way around. In this case, God demands that we sacrifice our sons to him. As if to redeem that, he says, all right, I make up for it. I'll murder and torture my son for you. What is this but what I said in my opening statement? The worst kind of primitive, barbaric, Bronze Age Palestinian sadomasochism. In what sense?
30 seconds.
I don't need 30 seconds. I leave the question with you. In what sense is this the root? In what sense is this the way, the truth, or the life? It is instead a worship of death, a worship of power, and an abnegation of freedom. And when we have seen through it, we will start to grow to our full human height. And I hope you'll join me in the enterprise. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is at this time that we will begin a Q&A between the two of them. Now, I'm not entirely sure how I'm to regulate this, but nonetheless, we will begin over here with Mr. D'Souza. The idea is short questions, short responses, back and forth. Gentlemen, we will take 15 minutes to do this.
Okay. Let's begin, Christopher, if I may, with Thomas Jefferson. You kind of implied that he might have been kind of going along with the Christianity of his day. That may be so, running for president and all. But in writing the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, a product of the Enlightenment, had a chance to lay out, drawing from Locke or Shaftesbury or anyone else, a theory of where our rights come from. Our basic rights, what he called our inalienable rights. And in thinking about this question, Jefferson, looking at all the possible sources of rights, social contracts, and so on, ultimately ends up saying that our rights come from only one source, what he calls the Creator. He can think, presumably, of no other source of rights. And moreover, it's because the rights come from the Creator that they are inalienable. If the rights came from anywhere else, if they are my rights, why shouldn't I be able to sell myself into slavery? I own my own body. It's mine. The presumption of rights from a creator is that, no, it's not entirely yours. You can sell your labor, but you can't sell your person.
Let's let Mr. Hitchens respond.
Well, isn't this a good point?
Yes, it is. I can easily say yes to the last thing you asked me. It's a reasonable point. Just as it's reasonable to know that in his letter to his nephew Peter Carr, Jefferson says, if you should conclude from your reading, which he enjoins him to pursue, if you should find as a result that you believe there is no God, you may find an extraordinary happiness coming over you. It's something I don't think that Jefferson could have written if he hadn't experienced it himself. I'm only speculating as one of his very junior biographers. It's as true as Nelson Rockefeller's famous remark, which his staff used to mimic from the wings when he made his speech, where he would always say, fatherhood of God means brotherhood of man, and his staff would say, here comes fog bomb, F-O-G-B-O-M, fatherhood of God, brotherhood of man. It's mantra. It's as if you couldn't have the brotherhood of man without the fatherhood of God. Now, that's the challenge you make to me, isn't it? Now, I'll return it to you. I'll share it with you later. Do you think that in order to believe in the brotherhood of man, of mankind, our solidarity, our duty to each other, you must believe in a supreme being? I invite you. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to applaud. You don't have to say yes. You don't have to say no. I would be very surprised if any of you thinks, I can't believe in the brotherhood without the fatherhood. I would be astonished. I myself, at any rate, can manage to do so. And I'm as glad of the amendment to the preamble of the Constitution that was made by Benjamin Franklin, a definite, a certifiable atheist, provable atheist, who said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Possibly the most muscular statement made in the preamble, because they don't require any supernatural endorsement. Because yes, we think that these things are innate, that we have these rights as a species, or we don't have them at all. But to claim that we have them and we need divine permission for them is somewhat over-egging the pudding.
Christopher,
Now
you're posing one to me.
That's right.
Oh, it's
yes.
my turn. Okay.
It's your turn.
Do you think that someone whose mother is a virgin has any special claim to attention for the remarks that they subsequently made? In other words, do you think that if I was to say to you, Dinesh, it's been fun chatting and everything, but I win this argument because my mother never went to bed with a man?
Well, I think your
Do you think that there's any reason to think that virgin birth means fatherhood of God or divine presence? And if you do, then what makes Christianity different from every other religion whose founder was born of an untainted mama?
Well, I must say, your question strikes me with underwhelming force, because not only is the argument for Christianity not dependent on the virgin birth, but there are in fact many different religions, including many from the pagan world, that do posit a virgin birth. There's nothing
That was my point.
about the virgin claim of Christianity, so it doesn't hinge on that. I do want to, if I may, come back and answer your point about Jefferson for this reason. I do think that the brotherhood of man does not follow from our status as Darwinian primates. If you look to the animal kingdom, you don't particularly see that theme stressed, for example, in the chimpanzee colony or among a pride of lions. The idea of domination, the idea of the strong conquering the weak, that appears to be evident in the animal kingdom. You've argued relentlessly that we are on a complete continuum with that, and yet you find us all assenting to a completely non-Darwinian principle. First of all, the guy who's a complete stranger, nothing to me genetically, and I could care less about him, I should, in some sense, posit him as equal to me. The meaning of self-evident is not that we don't need God for it. It means it's not evident at all. It's a moral, not a factual proposition. Because people are not equal in strength or speed or beauty or intelligence or any quality that we could specify. The self-evident means that there is a moral equality, and I want to ask you, what is its Darwinian origin?
The debate between William Jennings Bryan and
Darrow.
Edgell Mencken and we're talking, I'm sorry, about the Scopes trial in Tennessee, Dayton, Tennessee. Clarence Darrow and Edgell Mencken. Turned to a great extent, there's a very brilliant essay by Gary Wills on this, on whether or not William Jennings Bryan's suspicion was correct, that social Darwinism was in the background. That in other words, that if the teaching of evolution by natural selection and random mutation, that's the bit that's often left out, was accepted, that it would mean that the poor, the lame, the halt, the weak, and so on could be simply told, well, it's just too bad. You are that way because nature has made you so. Now, as anyone here can tell, there is no necessarily such corollary. There might be someone who says that's so, but it would not be, I think, discernible by anyone here that I, for example, who do believe that we have evolved by random mutation combined with natural selection for success in certain genes, believes that someone who is born blind or deaf and so on is simply to be left by the wayside. There's no such corollary. Knowing that the stronger are likelier to survive, knowing that, for example, you must all do this, write to the National Geographic, get your genome done, go to the man who's designed the National Geographic's Human Genome Project, see what you can get if you send them the scrubbings of the inside of your cheeks in a solution that they'll send you. It costs $100. They'll tell you exactly where in Africa your mother came from. They'll tell you by what means she got to where you and your ancestors were born. It's remarkable, absolutely remarkable. 75,000 years ago. our species was down to, we think, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 specimens in Africa. A horrifying thought for us. That's the nearest we came to extinction. Probably because of a catastrophic weather event of a Krakatoa kind in Indonesia, a climatic crisis of the kind we may face again. Managed to get off the savannah, for which we're adapted, and out and up to the north and some coolness. Well, we could have gone the way that we know for sure thing 98.9 of all species ever to have existed on this earth have gone to extinction. Now, I have to return the question, therefore. What designer did that to 98.9% of all of the species he ever created, and nearly to us too? If you're going to argue for that authority, if you're going to say that's the one in which you put your faith, you only rephrase the question. This God, this king, this tyrant, this creator, this organizer must be either A, very capricious, or very cruel, or very clumsy, or very incompetent, or possibly entirely indifferent, or all four or five. So you have not advanced 1 millimeter towards an explanation by proposing that all of these extraordinary events require a belief in a God. And you have suggested, though, that you would be willing to worship someone who was tyrannical to a degree unknown, unimaginable, undreamed of in the history of human despotism. You cannot get out of that moral and intellectual dilemma. Nothing you have said this evening, and I predict nothing you will say, will extricate you from it either.
Well, I won't get out of it unless you put a question to me.
Well, I'll leave the question where it lies, if you wish, or
I get it.
rephrase it.
I see the question.
Is your designer either cruel or clumsy, or perhaps unknowing or uncaring of the effect he has on his randomly created species?
I'm happy to try to answer the question while noting that you sidestepped mine. But the...
Wait. Wait. No, there's no demagogy.
It's now on my time.
No, someone has to get up, someone who clapped has to get up and say what I sidestepped. Who's going to be first? Come on.
Let us.
Come on. You. What did I sidestep?
He asked you what the moral foundation was for your belief system coming from evolution.
I'm going to ask at this time, we save the questions from the floor when we get to that point. But at this time,
don't be one of that clap anything crowd.
At this time, let's have a response here, and I'm going to ask both of you to keep your questions and the response just a bit more brief.
I don't ask you to clap anything.
Well, Christopher, I think if you're challenging the Christian theology, you've got to state the theology first and then say what's wrong with it. You can't pick out one strand of it, the creator God, benevolent, supervisory, and then say, well, look, if he's benevolent, how come the world looks like this? Because Christian theology has an account of what's happened to the world. In other words, in Christian theology, the idea is that there was a time, maybe a time, an ideal time, but nevertheless, let's call it the Garden of Eden, when things were, if you will, good, in harmony. Then there is a terrible calamity that separates man from God and has in man a stance of, you could almost call it, instinctive and obdurate rebellion against God. I think you know the emotion. You've been exhibiting it all night. So you got this.
Let's hear a response.
Well, no, I haven't had a chance to answer.
30 more seconds.
Okay. The point here is that the world is out of whack, and according to Christian theology, to some degree, it has been jettisoned by God. You could call that the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, which is to say that you and I are to some degree on our own pal, and that means that a Hitler, a hurricane, a tsunami is going to be unleashed in the world without, if you will, God being a cosmic bellhop to jump in and stop it at every juncture. So that's Christian theology. You can refute it as a whole. but I don't think you refute it effectively by just refuting part A while leaving out the rest of the story.
Well, so then my question would be very simple. Still willing to clap practically, I think.
Well,
my
actually,
question
isn't
would
it
be
my turn to ask you?
Do you or any of those who clapped believe that there was a time when there was an Edenic utopia from which we fell or were expelled, that forms a real part of human history, and that all of us are guilty of that fall? Who here
I'll
believes
answer that.
Who believes that? You do. That's important. Do you believe that?
Let's hear the response.
I can't ask them. I can ask. I can
do.
at least ask you. What reason do you have to believe that?
Well, first of all, I believe it, but I will say that within Christianity over 2,000 years, there is a debate over whether some of these things being described are to be taken literally or metaphorically. But let me just point out this. In the Western tradition, here is Rousseau imagining natural man long before the advent of civilization. Here are Locke and Hobbes and Machiavelli and others talking about the state of nature. You've never been there, and neither have I. So you have a completely secular project, which is not dismissed, I take it, by you as absurd, of positing what things were like in the original condition, and then how things got to be as messed up as they are. Christianity is responding to a fact that the way we are is not the way things ought to be. And there have been numerous attempts to account for that. Why are you treating the Christian explanation as prima facie absurd while admitting all the others as worthy of thoughtful consideration?
To say there's a world of difference between saying that there is an innate freedom or a right that belongs to us, or to say, in the very exaggerated tones of Rousseau, in the opening of his famous essay, that man is born free but is everywhere in chains. In other words, that there is no one who has the right to oppress or to deny freedom to a person. There's all the difference in the world between that and what you stated firmly, which was that there was an Edenic utopia from which, by our fault, we fell, and to which we owe, and for which we owe a king, an unelected monarch, a supreme being, an absolute tyrant, an explanation. Because otherwise we can be punished indefinitely for our fall.
Let me intervene.
That is not a Rousseauian view, and you have no right to confuse the two.
Well, you're
ladies and gentlemen, you should. Ladies and gentlemen, now is an opportunity to come forward to the mics. If you would like to ask questions, let me tell you, what you're hearing on the stage tonight is nothing compared to the car ride over here. Now, let me say something about this question and answer time. First of all, we're not interested in statements from the floor. People are here to hear the two gentlemen who are on the stage. So we ask that you keep your questions brief. Otherwise, it will be my responsibility to cut you off, and we will move from one mic to the next. And I'm sure these two gentlemen will have ample opportunity to respond to one another during this Q&A time, at which time, towards the end, we'll take an opportunity for them to have their closing remarks and statements. Let's begin over here. Who's your question for?
My question is directed at Mr. D'Souza, but also if Mr. Hitchens, if you'd like to wish to give a response, I would definitely love to hear it. Thank you both so much for being here. First of all, Mr. D'Souza, there have been, I'm going to obviously take you on your word that you believe what you have professed tonight, that the only way for what you call salvation is through Christ. Does it strike you as immoral that any of the deists or atheists among those who we've discussed tonight, Benjamin Franklin, Mr. Jefferson, and who I would add, Mr. Einstein, Mr. Thomas Paine, did not make this profession, that they were sent by your Creator to live in an eternity of hell and torment, even though I think we would all agree, have lived good lives, if not great lives, and have made significant contributions to all of us. Does this strike you as an immoral act? Thank you.
I think you've you've stated two propositions as identical that are actually distinct. The first one is Christ the way to salvation? As a Christian, I answer yes. And then your next question becomes that you've got a whole group of people, some of them Christian, but you might say unorthodox Christians. I don't think that Jefferson would deny that he was a Christian. He praised Christ for his moral teachings while denying his divinity. And so you have from deism to atheism a spectrum of views. The same thing with Einstein. Einstein said, I don't like these atheists who keep trying to recruit me as a member of their camp. And the reason he did that was he had, if you will, a tremendous reverence for what he called the mysterious natural order of the universe, an order that he knew could not have generated itself. So now you're asking me what's going to happen to all their souls? And my answer is, I don't know. I'm not standing in judgment of all these people who took this view or that view on the Trinity, or sat around and chopped off the parts of the Bible they didn't want. I'm not dispatching Thomas Jefferson to hell. So don't make the confusion between the positive Christian message about here's how you get to heaven with a kind of negative judgment, which is ultimately not yours or mine to make.
Mr. Hitchens?
I mean, I don't particularly disagree with that, though. If Jefferson denies the divinity of Christ, I think he denies that he is himself a Christian. I just make that as an obvious point. But you wouldn't know from this what I know and what I don't think is disgraceful, that Dinesh D'Souza is a communicating member of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I don't know what Dinesh thinks, and I don't think he's ever been asked to legislate on the point, but the head of that church, the Pope, as he's called by his supporters, the Bishop of Rome, as he's known to Anglicans, Joseph Ratzinger, as he's known by me, says that you may only hope to get to heaven by adherence to one Christian church. It's not a matter for Dinesh to legislate. That is, if you don't believe that, you're not really a Catholic. And if you don't believe that those who don't believe it and don't accept it may be faced with eternal punishment, you're not a Catholic either. It's only 2 years ago that the Church decided with great reluctance that limbo was not the destination for the souls of unbaptized children ever since Augustine. Now they say, well, maybe that's not true anymore. Well, for the millions of parents, for the hundreds of years who thought that's where their unbaptized children had gone, it was a real place ontologically, and the Church insisted that they believed in it. I think people are responsible for the logical and moral and probable consequences of what they believe. I think they should have the guts to stand up for them.
Let's next question from the floor here.
Most of the discussion tonight has been regarding whether or not God is real, whether or not Christianity is true. But the topic was raised early on, what is wrong with believing in God? If we remove the issue of truth for a moment and just look at outcome, from your position, if we assume everything that you believe is true, what is the harm in having 90% of the population believe in religious ideas that cause them to give more to charity, that cause them to donate more in their civic responsibilities, in their family responsibilities? And atheist regimes certainly kill 1,000 times more than any Christian or religious war have to date.
Very good. Let's go ahead and get the response.
I will. You won't think I'm ducking the question if I answer it in reverse order, I hope. Hitler's regime was the regime of a fanatical Catholic who had a concordat with the Vatican. Same is true of Mussolini, same is true of Franco. The word for fascism, if you take out just take out the word fascism from the whole history of the 1920s and 30s, put in the phrase Catholic right wing, you don't have to change a thing. Concordat with the Vatican, political support of the Roman Catholic Church, endorsement of crusades from Abyssinia to Spain to Libya, it's the same thing. Hitler's birthday was celebrated by order of the Church from every pulpit, every year, till the very last day of 1945, April 1945. Of the other member of the axis of Nazism and fascism, the Japanese emperor, he wasn't just a theocrat, he was actually a god. Are you telling me Nazism and fascism and the Axis was secular? You don't know what you're talking about.
Mr. D'Souza.
If you've got time, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why Kim Jong-il is I'll tell you why Kim Jong-il is a Confucian, and I'll also explain to you how Joseph Stalin was Russian Orthodox. If you've got time, this is not secularism. Now, as to doesn't it just make people? If religion only made people give to charity, why would I care?
Let's try to work through as many questions from the floor as we can. We have a long line, so let's have a quick response.
The gentleman's question is not answered yet.
Let me answer.
He said, why do I object? After all, if people believe in God, all they'll do is give money to charity. Isn't that what you said? That was his first question. I can't duck it, can I?
Well, you've had plenty of chance to answer it without doing so.
Religion makes people behave better. I don't mind if you say that. I don't mind if, though I would be embarrassed if you had to hear me saying, I give blood because I'm a secularist. Wouldn't you think that was a slightly sappy thing for me to be saying? After all, I'm a socialist. I don't lose a pint. I get it back with a cup of tea and a bit of water, but someone else has got one. It's the perfect socialist exchange. And I feel better for having given someone a pint of blood without losing one myself. I don't have to be a masochist. I don't have to grovel and suffer. I've done someone a favor, I've lost nothing. Couldn't be better. But if that's all religion did, but what religion does is this. Religion says, when someone comes to me and says, I want your children to be taught stultifying nonsense in school. I want them to be taught that they lived with dinosaurs and could have ridden on saddles on dinosaurs' backs. I want this done, and I'm going to court for it. Why? Because God wants me to do so.
Let's hear a response from Mr. D'Souza.
That's why. I'm not letting that door. I can't let that door hang open.
Let's hear the response here.
The reason Christopher feels good when he gives blood, and the reason that lions don't donate blood, is because we as human beings have this rather unique quality that seems largely absent in the animal kingdom. Call it the moral sense. Now, I do want to correct a couple of shocking statements and mischaracterizations that have been made here. First of all, I've written extensively on the issue of Hitler. You should read Richard Evans' multi-volume history of the Third Reich and a very interesting book called Hitler's Table Talk, edited by the eminent historian Hugh Trevor Roper, which is the private statements of Hitler in the 3 years when he was in fact at the height of his power. It becomes very clear that Hitler hated Christianity, wanted to destroy the church in as cunning a way as he could, and in fact mocked and scorned religion. He was in fact an atheist. Now, in the early years of Hitler, he sounded like he would say things like, I want to do the Lord's work. And why? Because he wanted to try to win over the Lutheran Church in Germany and the Catholic Church in Bavaria. But this failed completely. So what I'm saying is there is a huge literature on this. If you go on the atheist websites, they have a lot of crosses and swastikas from 1931 to 1933, but nothing at all once Hitler comes to power, when Hitler began a systematic campaign to destroy the churches. A final thought about this. His statement of what the Catholic Church teaches about salvation is flat out and dead wrong. Nowhere has Cardinal Ratzinger or the Pope or the previous Pope said anything to the effect that salvation is only within the Catholic Church. In fact, that idea was condemned in Vatican II as a kind of a heresy, and people like Father Feeney, who were teaching this doctrine, were in effect shut out from the Catholic Church. So I would say to Christopher that he is entitled to his own opinions, but he's not entitled to his own facts.
Good.
Let's go to the gentleman. Let's go to the gentleman here, and you'll have an opportunity to respond.
Well,
your question is for?
He's first.
Well, actually, it is for Mr. Souza. I'd like to state my respect for both of you. We had a meaningless exercise on our website at work, where everyone was required to post.
Let's have the question.
I'll get right to it. This is a meaningful setup. Who would you most like to have a beer with? A meaningless question. My answer was alive or dead. You had to pick two. Ronald Reagan, for his moral courage, his stance, his end to the Soviet Union, and then Christopher Hitchens was my living, then my dead. I thought I would stir it up, but it seemed that no one had heard of Mr. Hitchens. So it really caused no fury. I go to church with my wife every week, although I try to believe, as Mr. Hitchens' friends do, I'm not able to because I have many of the same questions. Whenever I ask the pastor questions, they're not answered.
Let's have a very quick question.
Okay, so they're reduced to, okay, this question. If God is a loving God and He is all-knowing, He knows your destiny as your soul is created. Your soul has been created and predetermined. Some have to be predetermined for a life of hell and torture. If He knows your destiny before you're born, He creates souls knowingly, destined for hell. How does a loving God do that?
Okay, I'll answer your question.
We'll end there.
Well, you have, let's look at, for example, some of the things that Christopher said earlier. He said, if there is a God, I want nothing to do with Him. If there is a heaven, I don't want to go there. For me, it's celestial North Korea. I don't want to stand in line and hand out garlands. So, all I'm saying is, in a universe of free will, all that God has to say to Christopher is, you have chosen freely, and I accede to your wish. God isn't flinging Christopher Hitchens into hell. Heaven is available to Christopher Hitchens, but he doesn't want to go there.
I have to say, I have to sound more judgmental than perhaps I have been up to now. Say that a half-truth is an absolutely terrible thing. What you've just said is very nearly true, but if it was true, morally true, if it had any intellectual integrity to it, I'd have to believe that free will is something I can be given. Now, if I can be given it, gifted it, it's not free will. I'd be told, you can refuse my offer of heaven if you like. You can refuse my human sacrifice, my willingness to be tortured to death in your sight to save you. You can refuse this wonderful offer if you want. You can't duck the offer. It will be made to you. But if you do refuse it, you have to depart into everlasting fire. This is not free will. This is the most capricious form of tyranny and sadomasochism. Surely that's plain to everybody here.
Yes, sir.
Now, while on the subject of half-truth, I simply have to say that it is not true that Hitler's compromise with Catholicism ended when his regime began. His regime began, in fact, with a concordat, the first treaty that the Nazi regime signed in its first week of existence with the Vatican, giving the Nazi Party a monopoly over education and the raising of all children in Germany in exchange for a Catholic monopoly in liturgical matters. And that Hitler's birthday was celebrated from the pulpit every year of the regime. And I love Hitler's table talk too, and I agree with Dinesh, I'll go this far. You should all read it. I'll tell you why. It's been asked ever since Nuremberg, many, many times, why was no member of the Nazi Party ever threatened with excommunication for taking part in the final solution? How can that be? The church would condemn people for the smallest thing. They would deny them the sacraments. 25%, according to Paul Johnson, Catholic historian, of the Waffen-SS were confessing, communicating Roman Catholics.
Let's hear
no one ever threatened at any point with excommunication for what the church knew was going on. But there was a member of the Nazi Party who was excommunicated.
I'll have to cut you off
and
there,
I'll tell you, no, wait,
this
sorry,
gentleman here on
I've
the
got to do
floor.
it, and it was Joseph Goebbels. And do you know why he was thrown out by the church? Shall I tell you? For marrying a divorced Protestant. Magda Goebbels.
Let's go to the gentleman down here.
That's where he crossed the
left.
line. That's in Hitler's table talk too.
Let's go to the
Check
gentleman
it
down
out.
here.
The Vatican does have its standards after all.
To whom, sir, do you direct your question?
The question is directed to both individuals, but specifically to D'Souza. Earlier, I felt like the caricaturization of atheists was that they were dodging belief in God because of moral issues. But the atheists and skeptics that I know, it's a matter of honesty. So I would like to ask both this question. What kind of person burns other persons alive for unflagging and unflinching honesty?
Okay. Mr. D'Souza?
Well, I confess no urge whatsoever to burn you alive. I'm delighted to entertain your question, however, and maybe burn it alive. But here's what I'm getting at, and that is, if you don't believe in something, because there isn't enough evidence, normally you just kind of go about your life as if that something didn't exist. For example, I don't believe in unicorns, but you'll notice I haven't written any books called The End of Unicorns, Unicorns Are Not Great, The Unicorn Delusion. You won't find a lifelong obsession with unicorns. I don't hold conferences on unicorns to denounce them. Here's what I'm getting at. When the atheist goes beyond mere disbelief into what you can call evangelical atheism, missionary atheism, a desire to proselytize, which is a hallmark. Why are you shouting at me? I'm answering your question. I know painfully for you, but I am answering it.
Let us go ahead. In order to move this along, we have a lot of people waiting in line, and we'll just have a simple response here. Let us go ahead and go to this woman here in the front. To whom is your question directed?
Actually, to Mr. Christopher Hitchens. Don't worry, God's not going to drag you kicking and screaming into heaven. Mr. D'Souza, I have read every single one of your books, and I know that you're a true biblical.
Let's have the question.
Yeah.
Let's have the question.
My question is, Mr. Hitchens, have you ever truly studied the Bible, the archaeological, the written evidence, the prophetic evidence? Have you truly ever studied the Bible?
Very good. Let's have your question, or your response.
I remember almost the first book I read when I began these investigations at the age of about 13, I think it was, 14, was an extraordinary book by a German archaeologist. Probably some people here have read it, called Werner Keller, called The Bible as History, the subtitle of which is Archaeology Confirms the Truth of the Book of Books. A very impressive book indeed. And I've since followed the work of the great Israeli archaeologists who were given the mandate by Ben-Gurion, as he put it, to go out and dig up the title deeds of our state, particularly Professor Israel Finkelstein, the head of the very distinguished archaeology department at the University of Tel Aviv, who impresses me very much by his scholarship and his honesty, because if there was any archaeologist who hoped he would find the evidence for Moses, for the Exodus, for the wandering, for the conquest of Canaan and so on, and the exile, it would be him. And they had control over all the relevant territory at the time, and they've been forced to concede what I think probably was all known all along. There isn't a word of truth to the story at all. There's nothing to it. None of this ever happened. The whole of the New Testament is a very clumsy, man-made fabrication, and we can be grateful for that, because if it was true, we'd be living under the tyranny of a God who mandated genocide, genital mutilation, mass murder, expulsion, theft, and infanticide. So, as I began by saying, it's not just that I don't think it's true, but my wish is not father to my thought. I don't think it's true. I add that I'm glad it's not true. I don't get those things the other way around. I don't think anyone who believes in a divine, redemptive Savior, Father, and so on, can really ever be acquitted on the same charge in the same way of saying that there is no wish-thinking element to their own belief. And in that respect, I defer to Sigmund Freud's famous essay, The Future of an Illusion, to which I commend all here who have not yet read it.
Well,
let's go ahead and have a question here, and then, of course, in your summary remarks, you can always address each other if there's anything here that you'd like to respond to. Sir, your question is for?
Brief as possible. The question's for both of you, as well as everyone here. I'd really like everyone to think about this. if we assume that the average age expectancy is 80 years old, you spoke of a last judgment. How is it justified, if we only live 80 some odd years, that we can be damned for all eternity? And I would like to say that I think this is not justice, this is sadism. Thank you.
Mr. D'Souza?
Let me say two things about it. Number one, it seems to me that you have, first of all, a concept of eternity that is forever, right? It goes on, it never stops, time never ends. I don't want to be the one to break the news to you, but time is a property of our universe. The Christian understanding is not eternity is essentially 1 million AD. The Christian understanding of eternity is a realm outside of space and time. So, in that sense, your objection is based upon a human understanding of historical time.
With our feeble earth brains, right?
Right. Now come to the rejection that you're talking about. The rejection you're talking about is not a prohibition, don't sin, stop sinning, or we're going to fling you into eternal damnation. It is simply accept that you are a fallible human creature. Is that so hard to accept? No. That you have committed sins for which you have not done full atonement. Do you accept that?
As everyone here would.
As everyone here would. And if there is a way to pay for those sins and all you have to do is utter the word yes to salvation, why, on what grounds do you refuse if what is available to you is eternal happiness, and if refusing has even the possibility of eternal separation from God? What obstinacy forces you to say, I won't do it, I will risk all of damnation with my full intelligence and free will?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking you.
I would simply rephrase my question to say if someone...
Don't rephrase it, answer. Mine.
My answer is, if we only live to 80, how can any of us be rewarded with eternity of happiness or damnation? It seems imbalanced.
Let me rephrase your question a little differently. You basically want to live in a world without moral choice and moral consequences. Isn't that what you're saying? You're saying, why do I have to make a decision? Why do I have to choose one way or the other? Why do I even have to sign on the dotted line? I'll tell you why.
Why are you attacking me?
I'm not attacking you, I'm attacking your argument. I'm not attacking you, I don't know you.
Let's hear a response from Mr. Let's hear a response from Mr. Hitchens.
Look, I mean, I've known Dinesh for a long time. I know him to be a very humane and courteous and considerate and decent man, and I don't think he understands how wicked he sounds to so many people in this hall tonight. When he says, look, you've made a perfectly fair offer. We can torture you to death if we want, for the crime only of being born, but all you have to do is throw yourself on our mercy, and it'll be okay. Why don't you just do it? My dear Dinesh, do you not know what you sound like when you say that? I can hardly bear to look at you.
You're implying
that you could say something so evil, so stupid, so nasty, and so intolerant. It is what Fulk Greville says in this wonderful verse. It says, here is the order. You are created sick, and you are ordered to recover. And you're ordered on pain of death and torture forever. This is totalitarianism to the nth degree.
No,
it is the most refinement of cruelty and stupidity that it's possible to picture.
It's
and
really
you don't
not.
get it when people ask, does it seem okay to you? Say, you always have the chance to sprawl and grovel and beg and plead, and you might get off.
No.
Let's hear the
You
response.
can't
Yeah,
know
let me
how you
answer.
sound.
Let's hear the response.
You can't know how
Let
you
me
sound.
answer. If there is a place...
You've already answered.
No, I haven't answered.
You've said it
because
3
you have
times
then-
now.
I tried to answer and you've caricatured my response. If there is a place called heaven in which there is no sin, how are we human beings who are sinful able to get there? You haven't confronted that question squarely. You want to deconstruct Christian theology? Well, let's look at its premise. Now, here's the point. There are certain decisions in life on which you will never have full information, and yet you still have to make a decision. I'll give you an obvious example. Let's say I'm dating a girl for 10 years. I now have to decide, should I ask her to marry me? I could say, you know what, I really don't know what life is going to be like with her for the next 40 years, so I'm going to be an agnostic. I'm going to keep waiting until the data comes in. The truth is, the data will never be in, even if I date her for another 5 years. At some point, I either have to propose, or if I don't make a choice, she will marry someone else, or we will both be dead. The practical necessity of life and also death forces us to make certain decisions even though we don't have full information. Now, we are always, as human beings, trying to A, deny our sinfulness, that's why I asked you the question, not because you're a sinner, we all are. But once we admit it, we then have to take seriously the idea that unrepented sins do carry some consequences, just as they do in this life.
Now, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, this will be the last question. And what I am going to ask these gentlemen to do is that in answering it, both of you responding to it, that you may also make your closing statements and remarks. And we will begin with Mr. Hitchens once this gentleman has asked his question.
Thank you. Let us assume for a moment that atheism takes hold and that religion in general and Christianity in particular begin to decline into a small minority. I would ask both gentlemen, what would be the characteristics and markers of a society as the decades unfold from there?
Just to be sure, so I don't want to appear to misunderstand you. You want to know how I visualize a post-Christian society, or post-religious one. Well, I think we're lucky enough to live in such a society already, one that says that you may not be required by the government or by the school or by the state or by the local authority to subscribe to or pay tithe to any religion of any kind. I often think that those of us like myself who were not born here appreciate this liberty more than those who were, and the uniqueness of it, that in the United States you may not be required to exert yourself for any faith or to contribute to the upkeep of any such thing. And so you already have the lineaments of a post-religious country. Religion is a private matter, in other words. It's up to you. You may send yourself to hell or decide that that's where you're going. You can't take me with you. And you can't ask me to pay taxes to someone who says otherwise. And this is the beginning of liberty politically, and I think the beginning of liberty morally and intellectually. That'll have to be my condensed statement on that point. To make my closing remarks, I think I'll make sure that Dinesh can't, within the time available, say that I didn't respond to his points. Just about his own church, because this has now become a salient matter, and after all, Dinesh is not just defending religion here, or even just Christianity here, or even simply saying that there might be a deist possibility or a theist one. He is actually saying that he defends a church that says that salvation is on offer here, redemption is on offer. He's making, though he doesn't make them publicly to you, he rather smuggles these things through customs, he's making very vast claims in a rather surreptitious manner. Now, as it happens, he's right. At the Second Vatican Council, the Church rather muted the idea, the Roman Church, that only by it could salvation be achieved, that those who were other kinds of Christian had just got it wrong and unfortunately were doomed. Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, others who they'd persecuted in the past, Jews who were considered responsible individually as well as collectively for the death of Christ, all of these were to be condemned. Some of that was rolled back and dumped for a bit, but under the regime of Joseph Ratzinger, many of these teachings and tenets are being retrieved and retooled, including the one that says there is an exclusive Catholic route to redemption. And I'll add another very sinister thing that's happening. The Pope has started offering indulgences again. Some of you will remember the Protestant Revolution, the Lutheran Revolution begins against the sale or offer of indulgences, of remittance of time in purgatory or hell in the future. those who attend Catholic youth festivals now, most recently in Australia, are told if you come in a certain spirit and you make a certain contribution, you may have a certain remittance of time in purgatory or hell in the future, or after your death. But if you make a really full-hearted commitment, you may get what's called a plenary indulgence. And that means, sorry to bore you with this, but I think it's important, remission for all the sins that you've committed up till now, which can only mean that the spatio-temporal continuum in the afterlife is considered to be the same as it is here. This is the most barbaric nonsense. And it's the sort of thing we thought we had left behind before even the protests made by Luther and Hus and the other martyrs of the Protestant Revolution. It is a repulsive concept. Now, on the question of Pascal, the famous wager that Dinesh put forward so softly, I think the best way perhaps to distinguish my view from his is to say what I think about it. The wager, this vulgar gamble, this three-card Monte offered by a Catholic reasoner says, what do you got to lose, Buster? Bet it's true and you win. Bet it's false, you lose. Why is that true and why is that moral?
I have to ask you to wrap up.
Yeah, first, who's asking? Who's asking you to make this way? Who's saying, which divinity is saying, get this wrong? I'm fascinated to see which way you bet, because if you bet wrong, you're going straight to hell. What about that, for one thing? Second, which deity is not capable of saying, well, Mr. Hitchens, I notice that you, even on penalty of hell and condemnation, will not agree to worship me. You've been told what the odds are, you've been told what the stakes are. They must have impressed you in some way, but you say the evidence isn't good enough and the reasoning is even worse. And would not the sort of deity that you might expect Dinesh D'Souza or Mr. Taunton to respect say, well, I make some allowance there for a little intellectual courage, perhaps, maybe a little moral integrity. No, you bet wrong, you're going to be tortured, not just for a long time, but forever. This is why I think I can close by saying that religion, as offered to you by its advocates, is immoral and irrational, and that the tyranny that it proposes you live under, fortunately, has no evidence to support the idea of its existence, and that by this discovery, and this alone, we are made aware of the truth, and that truth can make us free. Thank you.
I want to begin by noting in Christopher Hitchens a little bit of a, I would say, obsession with pinning me as a Catholic. And I think the reason for this is because, as I mentioned myself, my ancestors were arguably bludgeoned into Christianity by some stern missionaries. I'm sure my ancestors would disagree, but I'm actually glad that those missionaries came. And here's why. Someone asked Christopher earlier, have you actually given any thoughtful consideration to the Bible? You notice he didn't say yes, because the answer seems to be no. He attacks a Christianity that he constantly misdescribes and mischaracterizes. Let me give a couple of examples of why what I think his stronger arguments don't hold up. He says that our religion is a product of where we were born. True, but that is in some ways what you could call the genetic fallacy. If you and I were born in Papua New Guinea, most likely we would subscribe to worship the local deities, but neither would we believe Darwin's theory of evolution. We are very unlikely to accept Einstein's proposition that E equals mc squared. Conduct a vote among the Papua New Guineans and see how they come out on that one. The truth of Darwinism or Einstein or Christianity has nothing to do with whether or not we come to believe it because of where we were born. That's a fallacy. Christopher also allied himself with Freud's idea, which is that religion is a form of wish fulfillment. I believe it because I wish it to be true. Now imagine we all got in this room here this evening and we felt that life was tough, We have all kinds of ailments, diabetes, death is waiting for us. So we're going to make up a religion to make us feel good. I can completely see how we come up with the idea of heaven, which fits anyone's definition of wish fulfillment, eternal bliss, no suffering, no pain. I really don't see why we would come up with the idea of hell. Why? Because hell is worse than diabetes. Hell is worse than anything we would experience on earth. So why would a wish-fulfilling Jew or Christian come up not only with hell, but all these strictures of Christian morality, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. If this was all a matter of wish fulfillment, I'd get up and strike 3 of them myself. The Jewish, it might be true of some other faiths, but the Jewish and Christian religion do not look to any fair-minded person like they were invented because we wanted to feel better about ourselves. Freud was totally wrong in that sense. Now, I think the reason that I think a couple of questioners and Christopher Hitchens have been able to get on their high horse this evening is the following. There is a total unwillingness to face up to a simple fact, and that is, even as Darwinian primates, there is evil in the world that makes no Darwinian sense. For example, in the animal kingdom, you might find a lion that wants to chase an antelope, but will you find a lion that wants to wipe out the entire antelope population from the planet? In other words, I can understand why human beings to survive would want to kill off a rival. I don't understand why they would want to exterminate an entire population. This evil seems distinctive to human beings.
Because they're made in the image of God.
Nowhere in the animal kingdom. The point I'm trying to make is a Darwinian explanation is inadequate. And if you look at religion, it is an effort to account for phenomena that have no easy, natural explanation.
30 seconds.
What would a world be like, to answer your question, in which there was no Christianity, in which there was no God? You can't look at the example of Europe or the United States because we are cultures built on a Christian foundation. One of the most comical aspects of this debate is Christopher is standing on a Christian mountain even while trying to kick the ground out from under his feet. Even the moral principles he talks about came into this civilization because of Christianity. Here's my point. You want to find a secular society, you've got to go look at the communist societies which tried to completely extirpate not only God, but also the morality that came out of God. Philosophers like Nietzsche, who have thought hard about what a secular society would be like, Nietzsche says, if you want to get rid of God, you got to get rid of the idea of human dignity. You got to get rid of the idea of human equality. You got to get rid of this idea of liberty. And why? Because those are imports from the notion of a transcendent creator who created us special. If there's no God, we're not special. So what I'm saying is we haven't seriously confronted secularism in its most profound sense, not even, I'm sorry to say, the eloquent and worthy opponent, Christopher Hitchens. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know about all of you, but I am exhausted. I think you'll agree with me that these are two of the most interesting and engaging people that you're likely to encounter. And indeed, you may encounter them in a moment, as there will be a book signing in the lobby, so you can queue up for that. Audio and video recordings of this will be available on the Fixed Point Foundation website. You can make your way there. Thank you so very much, and thank them for coming.
Thank you.